I want to introduce our first speaker. Her name is Jan Pepler, who's going to talk about grant writing. Jan is probably going to pop on video in just a sec, and while she's preparing her presentation, I'm going to give her a little bit of an introduction.
Good morning.
Jan Pepler, PhD, has over 25 years of experience in nonprofit fundraising and development. Her experience includes grant writing, major donor cultivation and stewardship, capital campaigns, annual fund drives, special events, and small community group successful reach and surpass their fundraising goals. As a consultant, her specialty is working with management and boards to clarify mission, vision, objectives, and long-range plans, with an emphasis on the importance of individual contributions that support success of the entire organization. Additionally, as a writer and a former college English professor, she excels in the power of story, assisting others in articulating their passion and needs in ways that inspire others and what she enjoys most about her work. Jan, I am going to hand this over to you. Welcome, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Peter. I am really happy to be here, and I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you to everyone who is logged on, especially those of you in other countries and on the West Coast. I'm amazed. Glad to have you here. I'm going to just jump into the topic because we don't have a lot of time, and grant writing is a big topic. Brady and I both agree that we would encourage you to seek other resources. The purpose of this morning is really just to get you excited. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that grants are not always your best option for funding. So when you think about needing funding, grants are just one great tool in a whole toolbox. And sometimes you really need to think through what it is you need funding for and what the best options might be. So in particular, I know after almost 3 decades of working in fundraising, I've always had board members who come to me and say, there's this new grant by Bill Gates or someone else, and we should be applying for it. It's not that easy. And if you have board members that are saying that to you, have them come talk to me. Grants take a lot of time. Obviously, the time to write a grant is the first thing that we think of. And Brady and I both agree that depending on the funder and the complications of the grant, how much time you dedicate to actually writing varies. But at the very least, and I'm not kidding about this, you want to allot 6 months to prepare and write. And if you're going for a government grant, give yourself a year. Smaller foundations, maybe you can pull it off in a month. If you've already done grant writing in the past and you already have something that you can work from. So again, the writing of the grant takes a lot of time, but there's also the time that it takes to research the opportunities, and that is very important as well, and Brady will talk about that more. But 2 things that people often forget is it takes a lot of time to develop relationships with the funders, and that is critical. You must develop relationships. And then finally, if you do receive the money, when you do receive the money, it takes a lot of time to report back on how the funding was used. So grants take a lot of time. That being said, they're not as scary or as mysterious as you may think they are. And there are really 2 skills needed for grant writing. One is paying attention to detail, and the other is obviously writing. Those are 2 different parts of our brain. And typically if we're good at one of those, we may not be good at the other. So this is a good reason to always work in a team, or to have several people around you that are going to help augment your skills. So a lot of grant writing is gathering information, and that part seems kind of easy enough. But the other part is the narrative questions, and this is where a lot of people get stuck. So this is what I'm going to talk about. The first thing I want you to think about is that, hold on, you are not asking for money. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about fundraising and grant writing in particular. We tend to get hung up on this idea that we're asking for money. But the truth is that you are providing opportunity. Foundations exist specifically because they have money that they need to give away. And what you are doing is giving them a reason to feel good about giving away that money. You do this by engaging them in a story and making them the hero of that story. Yeah, don't forget that foundations are run by people who put money in there for a reason, and they just want to feel good about giving that money away. So you're engaging people in a story. Everything is a story, really. Everything is a story. We love stories. Try getting through a day without a story. I once heard a comedian say, rationalizations are more important than sex. Try getting through a day without a rationalization. I would actually say stories are more important than anything. Try getting through the morning without telling a story. Every time you talk to people, you are telling a story. Stories connect us. Stories are a critical part of our communication. They are how we engage other people, keep them interested, and just, get our concepts across. And a huge chunk of grant writing is just simply telling a story. So let's start with, what is your story? And I know this seems like, this isn't what I'm writing a grant for, but I promise you, just stay with me. This does make sense. First, consider, what is your motivation and your passion? Why are you working in the field that you're working in? Can you remember back to, the first time photography got you excited, or art or history, whatever it is that got you into doing what you're doing? You need to think about this. This is honestly important. And why are you at the organization that you are at and not somewhere else? Have a conversation with other people, people that know you, people that work with you, and write this down. Again, a huge part of grant writing is writing. So if you start with writing about your own story, it's gonna get the juices flowing, and it will help fuel the story that you write for asking for money. Now, while your story doesn't appear in the grant proposal, I promise you it's going to show through that grant proposal. And where your story will show up, undoubtedly, is in your conversations with funders. Because again, you need to develop that relationship with the funder. And at some point, this really does get asked of you, like, why do you do this work? And you need to have a good answer. So then, what is your organization story? Obviously, there's the mission and the vision that you refer back to. Hopefully, you know the origin story. Why did your organization start? How did it start? But think more deeply about this too. What are the challenges that your organization has had and had to overcome? What are your successes? What are the things that make your organization stand out? Why this is important is because while your own story doesn't show up in the grant proposal, your organization's story does. One of the very first narrative questions is the question about your organization. And most people will simply plug in the mission statement. The problem with that is that narrative question, the box for it inevitably allows maybe 250 words, but your mission statement's only 30 words. And you don't want to waste any of that precious space. If you think about your organization's story and you tease it out past the mission, you will be able to use up that entire narrative space in a way that then refers back to the project for which you're asking for money. And this is really, really important. I want you to also think about, how does funding change your organization's story? That may seem like an obvious, like, well, we couldn't exist without funding, but why are you an organization that needs funding? if you were a private organization, how would you be different? I want you to come at this from all different angles so that you can properly respond to funders when you're asked. And really, really talk to other people about this in your office. Hear their reasons for why they work where you guys work. Hear why they are inspired. You may think you know your organization's story, but you're going to get a much fuller picture when you talk to others and you start writing it down, because again, this is a great exercise for the narratives you're going to write for the grant proposal itself. Grant writing stories. The truth is that every single story, including the story that you're sharing with potential funder, has several fundamental components. And if there's any slide that I want you to copy, this is one of them. Every story needs a struggle. It needs a challenge to overcome. Every story needs a hero, and you want to make your funder your hero. And every story needs to be relatable. We'll talk about this some more. With these aspects in mind, you need to tailor your story to your audience. And this begins with research. This may sound obvious, but I can't emphasize this enough. You need to research absolutely everything about your potential funder. So it's not just about learning how much money they give away, what their priorities are, but where have they made exceptions in their funding? And why did they make those exceptions? What is the normal amount that they give away? What's the highest they give away? Why do they give the highest to some and not to others? How did their foundation start and why? What is their origin story? And then who works there? Who is on the board? All of these are really important aspects of your research that you have to do. And that is going to fuel building a relationship, and you must build a relationship. As Peter said, we are people. We want to connect. And again, your foundation is there to give away money. So they want to know who they're giving it to. Even if you're not talking to the people who are making the decision, you're talking to an employee, that filters back into the decision making. So you want to build that relationship early. Get in touch, make a phone call, show your enthusiasm, show your gratitude, ask questions. So super, super, super important. Then in terms of tailoring your story, keep in mind that you want to keep your story simple and authentic, particularly if you are writing the grant and grant writing is not your field. Fundraising isn't your field. You might be the curator or the director of a collection and you've been charged with having to write this grant. There's a tendency to get into the weeds. You don't need to. Stay focused on the most important aspects of the story, the passion, the purpose, the struggle, the need for a hero, and what the vision and solution is. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Along those same lines, you want several versions of your story available, and you're going to learn to adapt your story based on who you're talking to. Again, we do this in real life all the time. Somebody asks you about your weekend, and you may tell a coworker one version of your weekend, and then you tell a family member a different version of your weekend, and a friend a different version. You're going to do the same thing with the story that you are creating, asking for money. And where this changes is in a whole bunch of different ways. When you're in conversation with your funder, again, you got to get on the phone and talk to them. Based on what their interest is, you're going to have to adapt your story. This has happened to me many times where I've done a lot of research. I'm sure that I know exactly what they want to fund. We have the right request. I call them up and say, hey, I'm about to send in this proposal. I know you're going to love it. And then I find out, yeah, that is what we funded last year. For example, we fund technology and we fund computers, but this year we're really only going to fund computers based on how many people of color get to use those computers, or how many children. Like, oh, okay, then you have to kind of readjust the story that you're telling to fit that framework. In addition to, you're going to change your story based on the different funders, period. Okay, you're going to tailor this to your audience. Most importantly, you want to make the funder part of your story. This is absolutely critical. Why are they the right funder for the project? And I'm going to give you two examples for this. Both of them come from my time working at Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa. And the first example is an exhibition that a curator wanted to do of Shan Gosshorn, who was a North Carolina Cherokee woman, artist, who then moved to Tulsa, and she did traditional basket weaving. Right there, amazing. But more than that, she wove history into her baskets. She literally would take treaties and medical records and school records of children that had been taken away from their families, all these indigenous records, and she would print them out on paper that then she cut into these very fine strips, and she used that for the weave. History was literally woven into her art. But then she would weave these into amazing shapes that told stories as well. Shan Gosshorn's work was significant because it not only highlighted indigenous peoples and the history of indigenous peoples in the United States, but it highlighted women as artists, herself as an artist, and then particularly the issues regarding indigenous women. So when we looked at doing that exhibition, we went for the National Endowment of the Arts. We went straight to the top because the NEA is national, and these issues are of national importance. That is how we proposed it to the NEA, that only they really could do the justice that was needed for this kind of exhibition. But the NEA, of course, if you didn't know this, many grants require you to have matching funds. And the NEA definitely does as well. So we had to go to other foundations and ask for grants. One foundation in particular really cared about women in the arts. As long as it was women artists, that's what they were interested in. The Gosshorn exhibition not only featured the work, it's actually going on right now at the Gilcrease, not only features the work of Shan Gosshorn, but her influence on other female indigenous artists. So that was the angle that we really pushed there with that grant. For another grant, another smaller corporation grant, what they really cared about was creative art, taking traditional art and doing it differently. There, we had the story of this traditional basket weaving that then was done in this new, incredible way. So again, this is part of how you're tailoring your story, but you're taking that to the funder and matching it to who they are and letting them know that they're the hero, that their outreach, their scope is essential for reaching the vision of what you want to do with the project. So that's my first example. Exhibitions are a little bit easier. Also, anytime you have children involved or animals involved, it's a little bit easier to get funding. Look at everything that comes in your mail at the end of the year. There's always the child's photo or an animal. Years of working in fundraising, it's kind of a joke. If you are here this morning watching, you probably want funding for equipment or technology. And if you didn't know it already, that's not sexy. But here's how you get around that. It is making the connection to people. How does that technology impact people? So my other example is, again, at the Gilcrease. Part of the Gilcrease Museum is the Helmerich Center for American Research, and that houses an archive of historical papers, books, and even art. The Spanish colonial manuscript collection is part of the archives. These are documents that date all the way back to the 1400s through the 1600s. They are documents from the Spanish Inquisition. They are gorgeous, handwritten in Old Spanish documents that are written by Cortés himself. They are court cases against people who you were practicing the laws of Moses. In other words, Cortés was trying them for being Jewish. They are court cases regarding property, regarding women who were accused of being witches. These documents are incredibly fragile and have only been seen by a handful of academics. So obviously, we still say that, but the Gilcrease wanted funding for equipment to properly photograph and digitize this collection and get it online to increase the accessibility of these amazing documents outside of just a handful of academics. And when that was first being discussed, it was among scholars, you know, the people in the archives and the scholars and academics that already used it said, you know, geez, we're in Spain, we are in Germany, somebody in Tokyo, and I have to travel all the way there to see it. It would be so much easier if this was online. That is not enough to get funding because, again, your funder thinks that's a small audience. But when we were able to open it up and talk about accessibility for other populations, that changes things. So to go to a specific funder who cares about computer access for children, change the story to what does it mean for a 12th grader to be able to access these documents, especially if the 12th grader is of Hispanic descent, to be able to see this history and read through it and see it and integrate it into their lives. How does that impact society? I thought I had a slam dunk with, it was a small grant, 15 to 25,000 is what this small grant normally gave. And they were focused on typically anything that had to do with history and law. But when I talked to the contact, it turned out, as I said, hey, this is perfect connection. The contact said, you know what we're really interested in is the intersection between those laws that were happening in the Spanish Inquisition and religion. So are you going to have a way that you integrate the religious aspect of this? Can you bring in religion scholars or assure us that religious academics will be accessing this? And that is how we had to mold and shape, and we went after different funders specifically based on their interest. Yeah, okay, there we go. Recap. Just to put all of this in a slightly different language, you need, when you are writing stories for grants, you need to illustrate the need. Describe the importance of the need within a context of something greater. So again, regarding the Spanish colonial manuscript collection, the greater context was the ability for people around the world to see documents that impact laws today, it impacts discrimination today, and so on. Think about it in that way. Then you also need to frame a solution inside the vision. Remember, stories have struggles. So what is the struggle? And what is the vision that you're trying to overcome? And where is the long-lasting impact to this. Why does it matter? So again, for digitization and online accessibility, how does that matter in the world? In some ways, I think with the Spanish colonial manuscript collection, the more academics, the more people see this, it leads to changing laws potentially. It can reduce discrimination. If you're looking at other collections, you have to think about this in a broader way. And finally, you want to make the funder the hero. So identify how the funder's contribution makes a difference in reaching your vision. This is probably the second slide that I think is the most important in the whole presentation, and I hope you take note of it. Okay, now just kind of some technical stuff, honing your skill. And this is based on my years of being a college English composition professor and a writer myself. The first thing about writing grants is you need to write. Write. And you need to edit. But start first with writing. Just get it all down. Brady's going to talk about this as well. This is why I asked you to think about your story and think about your organization's story. Get the juices flowing. Just write, and then you're going to edit. And then you have to pay attention in your editing to your punctuation, your capitalization, and your grammar. Don't do it on your first drafts, but you need to circle back to this because it makes an impression on the funders. And you want to make sure it looks clean and it looks good and it looks like you're intelligent. Pay attention to your language. Again, I mentioned this earlier. We have a tendency, wherever we are in our industry, that we'll use industry jargon, and you want to be careful about that. The people reviewing your grants are people. And you have to walk that fine line between what information they know and what information they don't. I'm a firm believer that if you understand something really well, then you can explain it in any language. It doesn't have to be in your industry's language. And sometimes when you're using too much of your industry's language, you're losing the story, right? So please pay attention to your language. It is so critical.
Sorry to interrupt you real quick. You're at 4 minutes left of your presentation.
Yeah, thanks. It is absolutely critical that you have fresh eyes and you have other people look at your writing. Get other departments to look at it. There could be one sentence, one word that you change that absolutely is critical. So definitely get other people to look at it. And then you write more, you write, and then you edit. And most importantly, keep copies of all your drafts. Inevitably, there is going to be one sentence that you wrote that then you deleted, and later you realize, oh, you know what? That was probably the right sentence because now I realize I only have this many characters, or I have this many characters, I still have space. Keep all of your drafts. Save everything with a new title so that you can go back to it. Finally, stay excited. Remember all the reasons why you are doing this. Remember your passion, your enthusiasm. Remember the stories of your organization, and don't lose connection to that. It's vitally important. And get help when you get stuck. Reach out to colleagues, reach out to the foundation. They're there to help you. You really can do this. And I'm Jan Pepler. I will not write a grant for you, but I am really happy to talk to you regarding clarifying your story and talk to other people in your organization around your priorities and funding opportunities. And then there's other resources I really would like you to check out, the National Council of Nonprofits and the Grantmanship Center. So that's it. That's what I have to say. Maybe we can go on to questions now.
If you have questions, you can enter them into the chat. I will be flagging those questions momentarily for our speaker. So again, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat now, and I will mark them for the speaker.
Jan, I was saying thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation. We're on standby for some questions.
A minute of time here while we wait for those questions to be typed in, and partly because it is technically a question, I will go ahead and flag up the question, what do you call a bear with no ears? This question was asked during the joke request that was made at the beginning by Pete. So I have flagged it partly so you can see what that question system will look like when I put it up on the screen. So let's see if we have any new questions.
Is there anybody that has gotten stuck on a narrative question and might specifically want to ask about that? Okay, regarding building a relationship, how do you find the person or contact at the funder? That's a really great question. When you find the actual grant application itself, the contact is typically listed there. If not, you just contact the granting organization itself, and you go through the phone line. But typically, most grant applications do indicate who your contact is and who you'll call. Does that answer your question? Have you had a problem not finding that in particular?
Addresses the question, and Scott has indicated so. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, is it okay to go back to a funder again when your institution has been denied a grant previously? Absolutely. I can't stress that enough, and I think Brady has good stories about this as well, although Brady's got most of his grants approved. Yes, and that too is part of having a relationship with the funder. When you are denied funding, it's a great opportunity to call them. You thank them again for the opportunity. You find a reason why you are grateful, even if you did not get the funding. You continue to show your enthusiasm, support, and that's when you ask, why didn't we get the funding? What can we do differently? Can we come back? What do we need to do in order to come back and be successful? Once again, this is about relationships, and I've seen it happen repeatedly. The funder loves that you're not upset, but rather that you're still engaged, you're still interested, you're still passionate about your project, and you still think that they could be your hero. That's what they want to hear, and they want to tell you how to make it better, and they will. So absolutely go back to a funder when you've been denied, and go back right away and continue that conversation right away. Thank you. Good question.
I have used my position as moderator to ask a follow-on question to that. Obviously, the answer is going to be it varies, but could you give us some ballpark idea in your experience as to how many grants are recurring that are either annual or semi-annual or come back at some point in the future?
Oh, I think, in my experience, all grants you can continue to apply for. The only, and Brady can answer this perhaps differently, but the only restrictions that I have experienced is if you received, sometimes there are some grants with government grants, if you received funding this year, they don't want to fund you next year. Or if the funding was for the start up of a program, they don't want to fund you for that again. What they might fund for is continuation. So then they will direct you to a different kind of grant. But if you are denied, I've never seen there be a restriction for you to go back.
Thank you.
But yes, it does vary. Okay, can you talk a little about the difference in going to federal agencies versus private foundations? We have done more with federal grants where the process is quite different. That's a great question, Carla. And so I assume since your experience is more with federal agencies, that your question is more about private foundations. I will tell you, if you already have experience with federal agencies and federal grant writing, it's a lot easier going to private foundations. All the principles that I mentioned still apply. You're building a relationship, and it's a lot easier to build a relationship with a private foundation. And the grant requirements are usually not as deep and detailed and stringent as the federal requirements are. You have a little more maneuverability and room, and not as detail oriented. So personally, that's why I mentioned in the beginning that grant writing may not always be your best option. Private foundations are relationships that are considered major donors. And for some of those, it could simply be a 3-page proposal instead of having to fill out an entire form. And others, yes, there's still a form, but not as complicated as the federal grants.
Okay, we have 5 minutes remaining for Q&A. This next is very timely in the era of COVID and social distancing.
Jennifer asks, how has grant writing changed under new normal of the past 6 months? I don't know that it has. And again, Brady may have a different answer for you. I'm not sure that it has, because what has changed is major donor relationships, which traditionally are always done face-to-face, it's socializing, that kind of thing. Grant writing relationships are done on the phone, by and large. And that's what we've been doing for the last 6 months since this pandemic started. The one thing that I would emphasize again is in terms of having a team to help you, even if you are the one who is assigned to actually writing, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to talk to other people within your institution about this grant that you're writing. And that can be much easier when you're in the office and you have lunch together, or you do it over at coffee or the water fountain. Now you actually have to reach out and make those conversations happen, but you do need to do that because it is critical to get input from other departments to create a really rich and robust and rounded proposal. So that's the only way that I can see it having changed. Or that being said, you do want to go back and stay in contact with the funder because deadlines have changed. The Shan Gosshorn exhibition is one example of that. We did get the NEA money, which is fantastic. And that exhibition was supposed to start, I'm not kidding you, in May. Obviously it didn't. So the exhibition just opened now in October. Those are the kind of things with the funder that you want to double check for deadlines.
Combine 3 questions together here. The first of which is, do you have a list of grants you've personally consulted for? A second is, for beginners, where do you start looking for relevant funders? And the third is, what are the grant opportunities for private or for-profit institutions that might not be public-facing? I would qualify all 3 of those as questions related to where to look for the grant opportunities themselves.
Absolutely. And those are great questions. And I think Brady is going to have some more resources for you. And if it doesn't show up in his presentation, which is next, I know that I have those resources and I'll bring them to the round table, a quick look for them. I don't keep a list of everything that I've looked for. But yes, there are, and again, one place that you definitely want to go to is your National Council for Nonprofits. And you can Google search for them. The most difficult thing is finding the right opportunities for what it is you need funding for. I know even Jerry Ward with Digital Transitions has a few opportunities that are available. So talk to your regional representatives at DT. They seem to know some of the private foundations as well. And I feel like I'm not thoroughly answering this question, but let's talk about it again in the breakout.
Be there in that breakout after both of the grant-related presentations.
Absolutely.
We have a question here that says, is So successful funding, a who you know or what you know. I would sort of paraphrase that as, what is the nature when you build a relationship? What is the balance of what the word relationship is doing in that sentence?
It's really a combination of both. And again, it depends on what kind of funding organization you're looking at. Obviously, if you're going for a government grant, whether it's statewide or it's federal, who you know it's not going to make a factor, except building that relationship with your contact does. That funnels back, and they are going to profoundly help you shape what you're asking for. Ultimately, what you know is always critically important. And I'm going to say what you left out of that question is how you articulate what you know, how you articulate how you are going to use the money in a way that makes a difference. That ultimately is what gets your funder excited, whether you know them or not, whether they know you or not, and whether or not you are the best and the brightest in the field. If you've got a great vision and a great story where the funder gets to be the hero and help you, I'm telling you what, that I think is the key.